Do you also find it difficult to build up a meaningful relationship with your grandchildren at a distance? As a long-distance aunt to a 2-year-old in Australia, I wanted to create a solution for the millions of family members who cannot be physically together all the time. This is why I created Peekabond, an app that helps you to connect with young children at a distance. The app works with the following 3 steps. First, we give playful activities suggestions that are based on your child's development stage. These suggestions are science-based and gamified. Secondly, you can create a private family circle. And finally, we'll let you send videos back and forth so you don't have to be live at the same time and save them in one spot for your grandchild to watch. We've got over 120 content suggestions. You can build a love bank for your grandchildren. And if you go to the Cool Grandpa website and look for the affiliate links, sign up for a newsletter with a lot of inspiring content, or you can try the app for free.
Hey folks, I want to talk to you about this application Readio. I strongly recommend Readio to help grandparents and parents read to their grandchildren remotely when they can't be in the same room. Whether you're living across the country, across the world, or you're just gone on a business trip, Readio makes it easy for you to read to those young ones when you're away. It's a super easy tool that allows for video monitoring across the top of the screen so they can see you and you can see them, as well as having the book prominently displayed, making it easy for you to read to those young ones, or better yet, having them read to you. What I want you guys to do is go to cool-grandpa.us, look for the affiliate link for Readio, click on that link, and sign up today for your free trial. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Cool Grandpa podcast. Our conversation this week is with Donne Davis. Now, Donne found out that she was going to be a grandma in 2003, and she's been on a mission to connect with other grandmas and talk about all the fun stuff about being a grandma, as well as some of the challenges and heartache along those lines, too, of being a grandma. Now, we're going to dive in and talk about how she created this group called the GaGa Sisterhood, which is that collective of grandmas that come together and share in successes and triumphs, as well as they can receive support for challenges that might be going on with their relationships with their grandchildren, as well as with the parents of their grandchildren, right? Donne also has a newsletter called the GaGa Zine, and that comes out once a month. There's going to be links to that in the show notes. And she also has a book that we're going to talk about too, called When Being a Grandma Isn't So Grand, 4 Keys to Love Your Grandchild's Parents. This is going to be a fun and exciting conversation. Do me a favor, grandpas, when you're listening to this conversation, please share it and share this information about the GaGa Sisterhood with those grandmas in your life. So, without further ado, let's jump into the conversation. Hello, and welcome to the Cool Grandpa Podcast. This is your host, Greg Payne, coming at you from Studio 12. This podcast is about being the best possible grandpa you can be, focusing on what it is to be a grandpa and how we can all share that experience together for our grandchildren. Hi, Donne. Welcome to the Cool Grandpa Podcast. I really do appreciate you taking time out of your day to join us and sit down and talk to us about the GaGa Sisterhood, your experience with being a grandmother, and educating us grandfathers in the audience at large about the importance of grandparenting and grandmothers in particular.
Thanks for having me on. I was really looking forward to this conversation because it's my passion. I can talk for hours about grandparenting, and it's really fun to talk to a grandpa for a change.
Oh, I know. I feel like we're kind of, you know how we'd sometimes be divided up in classes and told not to speak or anything, but you and I are kind of passing notes about like what's going on with the other team or something similar.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think it's so interesting to get a perspective from a grandpa, because for all this time, I've been really focusing on grandmas in my GaGa Sisterhood. But I do remember vividly the moment I found out I was going to be a grandma. It was my daughter's birthday, and my husband and I were sitting with my daughter and son-in-law, and they handed us a bag, a little bag. And my daughter said, "Mom, I have a present for you. Even though it's my birthday, I have a present for you." And I took it out, and it was a license plate holder. And it said, "Grandparents finally." Now, I became a grandma in my early 50s, and I became a mom. Actually, I became a mom when I was 24. Well, my daughter didn't become a mom until she was 35. And so we had waited a long time.
Yeah.
But she wanted to establish her career like so many in that generation do. So we had been waiting. So that was why the grandparents finally. And I was so excited. Oh, I didn't know how excited I was going to be until I heard the news.
Oh, that's awesome. Now, how was your husband's reaction to this?
Oh, he was very excited too. So my husband and I were quite the opposite. We were married for 50 years. I'm definitely an extrovert. He was an introvert. So all of his reactions are much more subdued.
It was much more. There's a lot of jumping and high fives going on in his mind, and yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. But we were thrilled.
That's awesome. One of the reasons that I have you on the podcast is to talk a little bit and learn more about this awesome community you have for grandmas called the GaGa Sisterhood. Could you tell us a little bit about how you started this organization and how it came to be?
Yes, I'd love to. Well, I love to tell the story of the day that I witnessed the birth of my first grandchild. I was in the hospital room with my daughter. She had invited me to be at the birth, which I was thrilled. And I was standing at the foot of her hospital bed right next to the midwife. And when my little granddaughter entered the world, the midwife kind of lifted up her head, and I looked at my granddaughter and her eyes were wide open. And I literally went gaga. I leaped in the air, and then I ran down the hall to tell my husband, "We're grandparents." And it was really just, I've told that story so many times, but it was a pivotal moment for me. And I wanted to share something with you that I'm in the process of working on. One of my guests in December was a grandpa at my GaGa Sisterhood meeting, and he has 22 grandchildren. And every year he has written each of them a letter on their birthday. I was really inspired by this. And so I decided this year I'm writing a letter to my 3 granddaughters. So I already written one to the 15-year-old. And this one is to my granddaughter, my oldest, my firstborn, who's going to be 19. And I said, "Your birth changed the course of my life into a journey that has become my passion for 19 years, understanding and embracing the role of grandmother. You are not just my firstborn grandchild, but also the catalyst for a movement that began when I went completely gaga at your birth."
Oh, that's wonderful.
So yeah, I'm working on that letter, but that kind of tells you a lot about who I am, that I consider almost my primary role, my identity is as a grandma.
Wow. And do you feel like it was a sudden shift right at the moment of birth, or was it something that kind of evolved over, let's say, the term of the pregnancy as well?
I think it really hit me when that baby entered the world. And then what happened was that I spent about 2 weeks helping my daughter. My husband and I stayed there and we helped her. And I noticed that there were so many things that she was doing differently than I'd done when I was raising her. one of them was wrapping this baby in a Moby wrap and carrying her around all day long. And I'd never seen anything like that before. And I just was fascinated by it. And I was also kind of curious because she seemed really tired all the time. But I didn't want to say, well, I can kind of understand why you're tired because you never put the baby down. But I decided I won't say anything, but I need to talk to some other grandmas because this is such a different experience for me than my own parenting. And that's kind of when I started to think, it'd be really great to have some conversations with other grandmas. And at my retirement party, people said, what are you going to do when you retire? And I said, I'm going to start an organization for grandmas and I'm going to call it the GaGa Sisterhood because I was Gaga. And all the grandmas that I talked to were just as Gaga as I was. So that's kind of how it started.
Oh, that's wonderful. And I've got to ask you again, what was the name of that rap you were talking about on behalf of the grandfathers that don't know these things?
Yes.
What's
it's
the name and
Moby.
what is it?
It's a Moby wrap. It's a big, long piece of fabric. And I've seen a couple of grandpas actually with the grandchild up against, you put the baby up against your chest and then you wrap this long piece of fabric around you. And it's almost like you're carrying the baby in utero again there because they're so snug and they're so comfy in there.
Okay. So
I think it's like MOBY, Moby wrap.
So it's different from just that harness that we sometimes see that's either a chest carrier or back carrier.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. Now, one of the things that I wanted to ask you about too, and I had to write this out so I could get it, but on your website, you're on a mission to connect with other grandmas, explore what it means to be a modern grandma, and inspire grandmas to keep growing along with our grandchildren and our children. Can you tell me a little bit more about that mission statement? Because it's huge, and if you start to break it down, it really does become much larger than just the paragraph.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I've thought a lot about it. I think it's so important for grandmas and grandpas to really keep growing and to learn some of the things that our grandchildren and children are learning so that we can engage with them and engage in the same way that they're engaging, like learning how to text and learning how to do Instagram and all the things that they do in social media. So I think it's really important to continue growing. I also think it's wonderful to talk to people who are in the same stage of life that you're in. Just like I think it's so great that you're talking to grandpas, because so many times over the years, men have said to me, well, what about a grandpa brotherhood? I said, well, I don't really have the bandwidth to start an organization for grandpas. And I'm not sure that grandpas would want to engage the way grandmas do, but maybe they would.
Yeah, it's not the same. I know that grandpas want to be intentional and they want to be involved, but I don't think that we connect the same way, especially in a group setting. And that's partly, I don't know, gender roles and upbringing and just inherent differences, right? But I do know that, to your point, the grandfathers that I know and I've interviewed that have had very successful relationships and who I look up to have mentioned just what you were talking about in terms of continually learning and meeting the grandchildren and the children where they are, not being stuck with, well, I don't text. We never text when I was a kid, so you have to call me if you want. And it's, the grandfathers are telling me like, no. The kids are wanting to text or use Facebook Messenger or whatever the system is. Like, that's as important as a phone call. And in fact, sometimes even a little bit more, because I had one grandfather talk about how he was having a text exchange with his grandson, and his grandson was sharing some of that conversation with a buddy of his who needed to hear what a healthy relationship between a grandfather and a grandson was. So, during that interview, it wasn't anything super intimate between the two of them, but it was things like, hey, I hope you really do well on your recital tomorrow. I'm thinking about you. I'm doing that, and, the grandson was turning around and going, hey, here, taking screen captures or whatnot and sharing it with a buddy that just kind of needed to hear, and who may have been down in the dumps. I don't know the circumstances, but could have been down in the dumps about a relationship that he was experiencing with either a parent or a grandparent or something. And it's one of those like, hey, not all relationships are negative. And here's an example. So
that's beautiful.
Yeah.
And that's just what I'm talking about. You have to find the language, the tools that your grandchildren and children are using, or you're not going to be able to create that bond, which is so important. And that's really what my mission is to inspire grandmas to find ways to stay more connected.
I think one of the things that I loved about your book, and the book is called When Being a Grandma Isn't So Grand, 4 Keys to Love Your Grandchildren's Parents, is that if you want to be involved in those grandkids' lives, and nothing's guaranteed in this world, you've got to have a good relationship with the parents, right? Whether it's your son or daughter, whatever that is, and you're the son and daughter-in-law, or, essentially the parents of the grandchildren. And you went through and really talked about building that relationship up so that you can enjoy that relationship with the grandchildren.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I often say that the biggest misconception about first-time grandmas, and I want to include probably grandpas too, is that we think it's all about the relationship with our grandchild. But really, it starts with the relationship with the parents. And I encourage in my book to have a conversation even before your grandchild is born with the parents and say, what are your expectations for this relationship? If you have that kind of communication that you feel comfortable doing that, what are your expectations for me? And then if you get an opportunity, well, here are my expectations. I would love to be able to visit a couple of times a month, a week, a year, whatever your, however convenient or possible it is for you. And, how much would you like me to be involved? Because I would love to be involved this much. And, get it out in the open, and then really work at respecting what the parents are saying they want. And building that respect and mutual trust is what is really crucial for the ideal relationship.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. And on top of that too, I think that as grandparents and older parents, we of course want to dive in and hug those grandkids and do all this stuff with them. But respecting the boundaries that the adult children / parents are setting up is super important. And it doesn't mean that they don't want us involved or they don't need us involved or whatever. They're trying to figure this out themselves as young parents. And they're trying to set up boundaries to where they're not overtaxed. I think sometimes we think of it as like, oh, I wanted to come over this weekend and visit with the family and enjoy the grandson, granddaughter, grandchildren. But my daughter-in-law said no, that it was going to be tough to do. Or, however that communication is. Sometimes we got to step back and remember that, hey, daughter-in-laws and daughters in particular, I'm picking on them, there's a lot of pressure, especially when the in-laws are coming over, that sometimes we don't fully appreciate in terms of cleaning the house. What are the in-laws, all the judgment stuff that goes on in somebody's head, that ramps up a lot of pressure that we don't always understand. And so just accepting those boundaries and accepting, to your point, like, oh, they're totally okay with 2 times a month. And you know what? Next month, it might be 3 times a month just because of how things work out. But initially respecting those boundaries that are being set up.
Yeah. Well, you said something in the beginning there about new parents needing to kind of adjust to their roles. We're all adjusting to new roles as first-time grandparents, especially. And respecting those boundaries is really important. I remember one young mom I knew said she told her parents, I know this is going to be hard for you, but we want to cocoon with our baby for 2 weeks before anybody comes and visits. And her mother was crushed, but that's what they wanted to do. They wanted to get to know that baby all by themselves. And this is something that, a generation ago would have thought, what? I want to be there. So you really have to adapt to what the parents' needs and wants are. I think it's really important.
Right. And I think you brought up something important too, is that we've all got our past experiences to use as models, right? So it wasn't that long ago that when the baby's coming, everybody's dropping what they're doing. Everybody's heading to the hospital. The waiting room has, family all pacing up and down the hall in the waiting room. The sitcoms we see show you, you got aunts and uncles and grandpas and everybody else in the room for delivery. That's not so much the case anymore. And that's not even just a COVID related thing. It's hey, people are wanting some space. They're wanting some, a more intimate experience, and then being able to share that information. And of course, I think some of that is the technology that we have where, hey, I can get a picture of a brand new grandson 30 minutes after birth. I'm not necessarily having to wait 6 months until I go and see them. I can get some of this communication instantly. And I think just as parents, grandparents, we're all adjusting to these new uses of technology, new norms in parenting, and understanding that things aren't always the same, but that doesn't mean that they're worse.
And I think what that brings up another point, that we really have to remember not to take these things personally, that they are preferences that another generation has. And what I like to think of it as being kind of like an anthropologist who's studying this new culture that is just forming, and have a curiosity in a way that truly interested and not judgmental, but like, oh, tell me about this. So you're doing it this way. That's so fascinating. Tell me, what is it about it, what you're doing, that appeals to you? What made you choose this type of parenting? And to be really curious in a way that you feel excited to learn and not defensive and not hurt that it's not going the way you had hoped or imagined. Because expectations can really mess you up if you go in thinking it's going to be one way and it's not.
Well, and I think that's one of the things that we both try to call out with our audiences is that communication early and often, and I can't tell you how many, times we sit here and we watch movies and we read different books, and they're always saying communication early and often, set expectations, do all this stuff. And yet we sometimes don't do that, and especially I think as parents, it's like, well, I've been a parent of so-and-so for 25 years or 35 years. I know them better than whatever. And we've got to step back a little bit and go, well, if we did our job right, they're functioning adults with their own ideas and their own way of doing things, and they have to explore this aspect of adulthood themselves, just like we had to do it when we were that age.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure it was tough with our folks to deal with the things that we were going through.
I like to say that ideally you would like to be part of the team, but not the captain.
Oh, absolutely. As a grandfather, I'm like that. That's my thing. Is I tell my kids, you guys let me know what you need from me, because I'm perfectly happy being a little bit distant. Now that's a little bit of a difference between me and my wife, and it's just it's an attitude thing, and it's whatever. And sometimes she has to prompt me to get more involved, and then sometimes I have to kind of whisper in her ear, like, "Hey, we need to take a step back." You know, so we work well together to kind of find that happy medium.
That's great. Yeah.
I thought it was interesting that the title of the book was called "When Being a Grandma Isn't So Grand." And that is unusual, because normally grandparenting books and grandma books, it seems to be positive all over the title. You know, it's all rainbows and unicorns. And I thought it was refreshing to have something that's like, hey, you know, sometimes this role can be challenging, and sometimes it's not, the easiest thing in the world. But can you tell us a little bit more about how you came up with that particular title and what led you into it?
Mm-hmm. Well, as I mentioned, I have this organization of grandmas. We started meeting in 2003, and we have continued to meet for 19 years. And one of the topics early on was the challenges of being a grandma. And I say on my website, we talk about the joys and the challenges, because, as you said, it can often be sugar-coated. And it is a blissful relationship, and it's a blissful role to be a grandma. But the reality is that there are the parents involved, and we never experienced conflicts with our grandchildren, but sometimes with our children, it can be a little bit tricky and sticky. So if you don't see eye to eye on something, it can cause you to have some tension. And so we had this conversation at one of our GaGa meetings and talked about some of the challenges. And it was always about how we're getting along with our adult children. And I started thinking, you know, sometimes being a grandma isn't so grand. And I thought, ooh, I think I might want to use that as a title. Now, it can be off-putting to a grandma who's just in seventh heaven, you know, over the moon, and thinking, what? Sometimes being a grandma isn't so grand? Well, I haven't experienced that, but maybe she won't. But on the other hand, people are people. And, you know, we come together in these relationships, and it can be four people who have really different concepts of what they all want. So that's how I came up with the title of When Being a Grandma Isn't So Grand. But then I put the subtitle in, which is 4 Keys to Love Your Grandchild's Parents. And people laugh when they hear that, because then they get it. They get that it really has to do with that relationship with your grandchild's parents.
It does. And I think too, for me, if I was reading that, you know, when I'm reading the title for the first time, to me, it's a little bit of a prompt of, if I'm thinking everything is so hunky-dory, maybe there's something I'm missing, you know, and it could be that grandparent, grandma or grandpa, you know, is being a little bit overbearing or not reading cues correctly. Mm-hmm. And you're going through life thinking, oh, everything's grand. But then your children are struggling with, expectations of whatever. And I think sometimes that can lead into big explosive confrontations down the road where, you get back in your car to drive home and it's like, I didn't know I was doing anything wrong. I thought we were all fine. What's going, that sort of thing.
That's so true, that if you don't release some of the tension every now and then, one little thing could trigger it. And you were mentioning earlier about how having the grandparents come over can put a lot of pressure on the mom, especially feeling like she's got a host and she has to have the house looking a certain way. And I've had grandmas tell me that sometimes they'll say, can I put the dishes away for you? And the daughter or the daughter-in-law misconstrues it as like, oh, I must be putting the dishes away wrong and she wants to do it the right way. Just a little thing can set people off. And so I like to sometimes say, I noticed that there was something bothering you, and I'm wondering, is it something I said or something I did that you want to tell me? Because I feel like there's some tension here. It's not easy to say.
No, it's very hard, especially I think for new relationships on both sides, right? Because if you think about it, let's say you're 6 months into your children having just gotten married. So everybody's in this honeymoon phase. Everybody's still trying to work out expectations, assumptions, what past has been brought into the relationships, all these things. Nobody knows exactly how to take comments. Nobody knows grandpa's weird sense of humor and how to respond to that. And there's a lot going on there. And I think everybody just needs to take a little bit of an adjustment period. That's one reason I don't mind being a little bit distant from my children and the grandchildren. I'm 500 miles away, so we're a day's drive away or a short Southwest flight. And I've talked to a lot of grandfathers and people that grew up with grandparents living next door, same neighborhood, all great relationships. But for me, I like having a little bit of distance so that we have really awesome interactions for short periods of time. And I don't have enough time with my daughter-in-laws to get on their nerves.
Yeah. Well, they're just a short distance is a good way to be, because, I know a lot of grandmas who live close by and they're called on for babysitting a lot. And sometimes it can be hard to say no and set some boundaries. Well, but then there are others. One of my GaGa members retired from being an ER doctor when her granddaughter was born and came out to California from Boston and is taking care of her infant granddaughter 5 days a week.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. Quite a commitment.
Oh, it is. And and you brought up an interesting point as far as the babysitting aspect, because I do ask grandfathers that live very close by to talk about how they separate out babysitting time versus special grandpa time, right? Because if you're babysitting all the time, it's great. Love having the grandkids over. They all mention that they love having these play dates. A number of the grandfathers are still working, but I think there's also a little bit of a challenge there for the quote special grandparent time, because if you're seeing grandma and grandpa all the time, then it's not the same versus, I see them once a month or once a quarter kind of activities. Now, in your book, you did have, and I'm going back to the 4 keys to love, and I know that's an acronym. Can you walk us through what love stands for?
Yes. L stands for learn the parent's language. And along with that is learn the parents' rules, their parenting methods, and anything else that they believe strongly in. Because when you understand where they're coming from and the rationale, it's a lot easier to go along with the program, as I like to say. And I had to get on board with a lot of different programs with my daughter and her two daughters, because everything was different, as I said, from the attachment parenting, where she carried the baby around all the time, co-sleeping with the baby. She taught them baby sign language. She homeschooled her children. So all these things, I said, I had to get on board with all these. So learn the parent's language. The O stands for own your shared purpose. And before, when I mentioned that you really want to be part of the team, I think if you understand that you really all have the same goal in mind, that you want to help nurture this tiny little human being who's come into your life and give them the best life that they can have, then you want to own that purpose. The V is to value the parent's hard work. And I think this is so important. You could also say validate, but look for opportunities to tell the parents what a great job they're doing. And don't just say, oh, you're a great mom or you're a great dad, but I love the way you comfort and soothe the baby when she's having a tummy ache or something like that. So point out when you see them doing it, just like when we were parents and we saw our kids doing the right thing, we wanted to reinforce that. It's the same thing. Validate their hard work, because they are working hard. And then the E stands for empathize. Empathize, empathize, empathize is what I say in my book, because they don't want advice. The number one rule for grandparents is don't give advice that's not solicited, that's not requested, because that will just really turn parents off. But if you empathize with them, and I found this really hard to do, but my daughter, who's a therapist, taught me how to be more empathic. And so if your child is complaining about how exhausted they are, instead of saying, well, why don't you get more sleep? You might say, oh my gosh, that's so hard. You know, I remember it was really exhausting for me too. And I can understand how tired you must feel because you're doing so much and it's hard to take all that in. So empathize with them.
That empathy thing reminds me so much of sometimes what I'm going to say the guys are told with marriage advice, right? Because and I'm using broad statements and exceptions to everything, but guys tend to be fixers, right? So, we get told when you're newly married, like sometimes you just need to listen and empathize and not try to fix.
And grandmas are fixers too. Oh yeah. We've got advice like you wouldn't believe, but you got to kind of zip your lip.
Yeah, and I've got to relearn that, and grandparents need to relearn that idea of sometimes all that somebody wants, a son or daughter that's had a long day, like you were talking about, is just going, I bet it is tough. I'm sorry to hear, that you're struggling with this. And then what that does is it really opens the door for them to be more vulnerable and to let you in to help with the problem solving. Because I think like everybody, as we grow up, we want to show that we can solve our own problems and we can fix our own messes and we can do these things. And it becomes hard to ask for help when everything feels like a judgment conversation or, hey, it may be received as you're too dumb to figure out your own problem here. Here's what your problem is. And it's it's not even necessarily intended to be that way. It's just that natural fixer that we all tend to get into. So one thing I wanted to ask you from a grandma and mom's perspective and people that you've talked to is, how do you think the role of grandpa is in that grandparent relationship, and where can grandpas sometimes fit in? And this is a little bit of asking the other team for inside information.
Well, I think that it really is a team. If you're blessed to be a couple as grandma and grandpa, you can be a stronger team together. And one of the things that I think is so important is that we're role models for our grandchildren. We're role models in the way we as husband and wife communicate with each other in front of our grandchildren, the way we communicate with our children, and the values that we show in how we act and how we speak and what we do with our grandchildren and the amount of involvement that we do. These are all things that we model, and both grandmas and grandpas do it equally in different ways. But I do know that with my late husband, he tended to let me take center stage. And I think there would be times when I would regret that my granddaughters always wanted to sit on my lap. And so I think my daughter figured out that when we had birthdays, that whoever was giving a gift, the grandchild would sit on that person's lap or next to that person's lap to include them, especially like if the other grandparents were there. Because sometimes, children can have favorite grandparents, and there can be some rivalry between the grandparents sometimes. So if they're all there, I remember this vividly, that my daughter, when the other grandparents were giving a present to one of my granddaughters, my daughter would put the little baby, or, if she was a toddler or whatever, next to the other grandparents instead of her always sitting on my lap. So I think doing the same thing with grandpa is getting him equally engaged or differently engaged.
I definitely agree with that. And I've talked with, you're going to like this, I talked with grandfathers who primarily had sons or only had sons growing up. And then the next thing they knew, they were grandparents to a whole bunch of granddaughters. And there was a whole adjustment period that was going on there. And they did counsel me, because I'm a new grandfather myself. My oldest grandson is 3.5. My oldest granddaughter is about 1.5 years. And those grandfathers that had primarily granddaughters were saying, Greg, look, kids are going to love you, but at times the granddaughters are going to go to the grandmothers, especially at different ages. And they're like, it's important that grandfathers know that that's not that the granddaughters don't love grandpa, don't whatever, but there's different times where they click differently with different grandparents for different reasons at different occasions.
Yeah. Well, my late husband had grandson envy, because we only have we have 3 granddaughters, but he used to do things that were his passion. He was a physicist and a scientist, and so he taught them about the planets, and he did art projects with them and various other things that were of interest to him, taught them to play chess and played games with them. So I think it can be that you can enjoy children of the opposite sex or whatever you are, so that you can find ways to engage in so many different ways.
Oh, absolutely. And the other, I had a 3-star retired Air Force general on that was talking about his granddaughters. And he's like, look, when the granddaughters say it's time to get down and play Barbies, I'm down on the floor and we're playing Barbies.
Mm-hmm.
And then when the grandsons want to go outside and kick the soccer ball and do that, we're doing that and shifting gears. The other part that I wanted to share was, and it's been a little while since I've had adult granddaughters on talking about the influence of their grandfathers, but a lot of those women appreciated the fact that grandfathers treated them no different from the grandsons, in that at times that were appropriate and at ages appropriate, the granddaughters were expected to come out and help with the farm work and clean out the shed and do these different things. And the granddaughters, now in their 40s and above, were like, that was when I learned that I can do things that my brothers can do, and there's certainly physical differences and all that kind of stuff, but it was that granddad treated me the same. He didn't treat me different.
Yeah.
So.
Well, one thing we haven't talked about too much that I did want to put in a little plug for, because if grandpas are listening to your podcast, I hope they'll tell their wives about the GaGa Sisterhood, because it is a national organization and we meet on Zoom every other month. Last year during the pandemic, we actually met every single month. And I have speakers that come and give talks on all different kinds of things related to grandparenting. I had the inaugural poet, Amanda Gorman's grandmother, as one of my speakers last year. And that was very exciting to hear her perspective on what it's like to have an internationally acclaimed granddaughter. That was really exciting.
Oh, that's awesome. And I did want to make sure that we let people know and have you share the best way that people can find the GaGa Sisterhood, get connected with you.
Well, I have a website. It's gagasisterhood.com. And I post a blog every week about something related to grandparenting. And then I host meetings. I've been basically hosting a speaker series for grandmas for 19 years. And I kind of divided up into 3 categories. We have speakers who talk about fun ways to connect with your grandchildren. So we've had speakers teach us improv, storytelling, reading, crafts, all kinds of fun things, and long distance, tips for long distance. Last year, we had a wonderful speaker who's a mom, not a grandma, and she talked about how to connect with your long distance grandchildren. And then we have speakers who've talked about how to stay connected and build a good relationship with our adult children. And then the third category of speakers is self-development and self-improvement. So we've had speakers on meditation. We've had just enlightening speakers. I had last year Paula Spahn, who's a writer for the New York Times, and she's written a book about her grandparenting experience. And she's a wonderful speaker and writer, and talked about some of the lessons that she's learned as a grandma, and given some of the scientific research on things that are related to grandparenting. So we have a wide variety of topics. And as I said, I had a grandpa last December who told us really fun ways to stay connected with our grandchildren and the fun activities that he does with his grandchildren. So I really, through these meetings, I've met grandmas from all over the country who come to the GaGa Sisterhood, and we just love to share our wisdom with each other and what we've learned over the years. And it's a wide variety of ages of grandchildren in our GaGa Sisterhood.
Oh, that sounds like a fantastic community. And it's great that people can get together and find these groups online and in their physical communities to share that, because sometimes it can be lonely, and sometimes we can be making, as we talked about early, a lot of misconceptions about what's going on. And, we're hearing these new weird parenting styles, and, the next thing we know, we think the kids are running off to a cult somewhere. And it's like, no, it's just here's the new child development thoughts, and here's what's going on.
Well, there aren't a lot of opportunities for people to sit down with people who are in the same stage of life as you and have a conversation like you and I are having, where we really get into the conscious state of mind that you need to be in a good relationship. I think that's what today's parents are very conscious. And I think today's grandparents, a lot of grandparents are really conscious of their behavior and their actions, at least the grandmas that I know. And that's kind of why a lot of grandmas come to the GaGa Sisterhood, is they love talking about their role as a grandma, and they want to learn more. They want to hear from other grandmas what their experiences are like.
I agree with that a lot, because as part of why I started this podcast was to learn some of these tips and tricks that either grandfathers that have come before us have done with adult grandchildren and learning that relationship, and being able to give people an opportunity to pick and choose what might work for their relationship when they hear these stories and they hear these different approaches to being a grandfather in my case, but grandparent at large.
You know, another thing that occurs to me, I've been a grandma now for almost 19 years, and I have been through the whole stages of all these granddaughters. And, you know, I was so engaged with them, and then they became teenagers. And now my oldest is at college, but we still find ways to connect. I don't know if you're familiar with the New York Times Wordle puzzle.
Yes.
It's quite the rage. Well, my granddaughter wrote to me about a month ago and said, "Do you know about Wordle?" And I had just learned about it about a month before. So every day she sends me her Wordle solution, of course, not showing the words, but she shows me, you know, how many tries it took her to get the word. And I find that so fun that we keep evolving. So it's hard, you know, when your grandchildren are older. I remember how great I used to feel when they'd come running down the driveway when I arrived. And then they became teenagers and they just wait until I come in the door and go, "Oh, hi." But, you know, we still find ways to connect. And I helped my oldest granddaughter write some of her essays for college. And I just find ways to continue to engage with them. And I think that's what grandmas need to remember, that when they get a little bit older, you're not going to be the number one spot on their playlist anymore. But, you know, you're going to have a role. And if you've set that foundation, you're definitely it's going to stay there.
Well, in keeping with that music theme, I think what we end up finding out when we establish positive relationships early in those grandchildren's lives, to your point, we may not be number one on the playlist anymore, but we're that one album or CD that they're not going to give up when they move. You know, that CD and that album is going to be in the box that makes it to the next apartment.
Oh, I love that, Greg. That is a beautiful metaphor.
Well, you set me up for it, so there you go.
Teamwork.
Absolutely. Now, before we let you go, any other last ideas or anything that popped into your mind that you want to share about that I haven't asked you?
Well, I do have an Instagram account.
Okay.
And I can thank my oldest granddaughter for that, because I was late in the game in getting in, but she set me up with an Instagram account about a year and a half ago. And I have met so many interesting grandmas on Instagram. It's at GaGa Sisterhood. And I've just really enjoyed putting posts out every day with fun things to make grandmas laugh, or to say, "Oh yeah, I get that." So if people want to check me out on Instagram, I would love to connect with grandmas and grandpas. I have a grandpa who's one of my followers.
Oh, fantastic. And we'll be sure to put that link to the Instagram account in the show notes as well. So,
okay, great.
Folks, if you're driving around and you couldn't write it down, just check out the website and it'll be in the links. Well, Donnie, I sure do appreciate you stopping by the Cool Grandpa podcast, sharing your insights with being a grandmother and about the GaGa Sisterhood, because I think this is going to be a really nice community for the grandmas that listen to this episode, as well as the grandfathers that can refer their wives to some place where they can feel supported and they can feel like they've got a shared community.
Well, thank you, Greg. And I am definitely going to write about the Cool Grandpa podcast too, because you're a wonderful resource.
Oh, well, thank you so much. And have a good evening now.
Thanks.
Boy, was it fun to talk to Donnie. I really enjoyed listening to her story about creating the GaGa Sisterhood. It's very similar to the experience that I'm having getting this cool grandpa off the ground and starting to build this community where grandpas can come together, talk about successes, and we can also talk about some of the challenges that we face as grandpas and also the challenges that we face in our relationships with our grandchildren and our grandchildren's parents. One of the big takeaways that I had was this idea of not trying to fix what's going on with the parents' lives. We were talking about how the mom was feeling so tired carrying the child around and dealing with a newborn for the first time. And the great advice that Donnie had, which is, hey, just go, I remember how tough it was. You're doing a great job. We're not stepping in to try to fix anything. We're just there to listen and give support. And we can jump in and fix things, but we need to be careful that we're being asked to step into that space and help resolve any kind of an issue. Even if it's a temporary issue of babysitting a grandchild for a few hours so that the new mom can go in and grab a quick nap in the afternoon. What was your big takeaway from this conversation? I know Donnie and I would love to have your feedback. So go to the website, cool-grandpa.us, find this episode, and leave us a comment in the show notes. And if you've enjoyed this and found it interesting and a useful resource for a grandma that you know, please share this conversation with them. So until next time, remember to stay cool. Thank you for listening to the Cool Grandpa Podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please do me a favor and share it with a friend. That's the best way you can help us to expand our community, as well as get the news out about how valuable grandpas are in the lives of those kids. If you'd like to leave me a comment or shoot me a potential topic for this podcast, please go to www.cool-grandpa.us. Look for the comments tab, fill it out, hit submit. It's as easy as that. Until next time, remember to stay cool.